something just happened that has left everyone in utter disbelief. And it's not coming from the media spin or legal speculation. No, this time it's straight from Blake Lively herself. After months of public denials, closed-door hearings, and strategic PR maneuvers, Blake Lively may have just delivered the final blow to her own case. In a shocking twist that legal analysts are calling self-sabotage, newly surfaced documents and courtroom reactions reveal that Blake's recent legal moves may have backfired in the most explosive way possible. It all started when Blake's legal team pushed to have crucial evidence sealed, namely the messages that could have tied her motivations to her campaign against Justin Baldoni. But not only did the court deny that request, it also signaled something far more devastating: that the evidence in question was now fair game for full public scrutiny. And just when it looked like things couldn't spiral any faster, a legal filing authored and signed by Blake's own attorneys seemed to directly contradict claims she made publicly just weeks prior. Now critics are saying that Blake Lively may have torpedoed her own credibility. Legal experts are calling it one of the most puzzling missteps in a high-profile celebrity case in years. And fans, well, they're left stunned by what appears to be a collapse in real time. Has Blake Lively lost control of her legal narrative? Did she underestimate the power of the very documents she fought so hard to hide? Or worse, did she never think they'd be revealed at all? As the courtroom reels from the impact of this latest revelation, we break down every angle of the implosion, from the legal implications to the cultural fallout. Because this isn't just a moment, this could be the moment everything changes. Let's dive deep into how Blake Lively may have just destroyed her own case. For months, the entertainment world has been gripped by one of the most unexpected and polarizing legal battles in recent memory: Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni. What started as quiet whispers about behind-the-scenes tension exploded into full-blown legal warfare. But the most shocking twist, it's not what Justin said or did, it's what Blake's own legal team has now done, and how their strategy may have imploded her entire case. Let's rewind. At first, Blake Lively presented herself as the composed, unbothered star, one whose only goal was to protect her image, reputation, and family from what she claimed were baseless insinuations. She painted Justin Baldoni's actions as invasive, inappropriate, and professionally damaging. But as the legal filings stacked up, the timeline began to blur. What exactly did Justin say? What was being suppressed? Why was Blake taking legal action so aggressively? And more importantly, what was she trying to hide? The original complaint filed by Blake Lively's team focused heavily on defamation, reputational harm, and alleged misconduct in the public eye. Her attorneys argued that Justin's creative project statements and even passive media appearances were indirectly tarnishing Blake's brand. What started as a civil matter soon turned into a media circus, especially as Taylor Swift's name entered the conversation. Allegations emerged about internal Hollywood politics, secret text exchanges, and possible behind-the-scenes manipulation that connected multiple A-list figures. And Blake, she was suddenly at the center of it all. Still, she remained publicly silent, only speaking through her attorneys or curated press releases. But behind the curtain, she was reportedly working overtime to control the narrative. PR consultants were brought in, media outlets received exclusive sources, her image was polished, and the public, for a moment, it seemed like she had them on her side. But cracks started to show. First, it was the inconsistencies in her claims. Journalists and online commentators pointed out discrepancies between what Blake's team said in filings versus what reporters had heard from industry insiders. Then certain content creators, some with barely a handful of subscribers, began receiving unexpected legal notices, some even subpoenas. That move alone raised eyebrows. Was Blake Lively truly trying to silence commentary from creators with little influence? And if so, why? It wasn't long before people began to question whether this case was about defamation or about control. Enter Justin Baldoni's team. Rather than match Blake's legal aggression with equal hostility, Justin played the long game. His responses were measured, respectful, and strategic. He never publicly attacked Blake. Instead, his team began filing surgical countermotions, ones that demanded transparency from Blake's side. They asked for specific messages, emails, and evidence that could support or disprove Blake's claims. And that's when everything started shifting. The media tide began turning. Commentary channels and legal analysts began focusing less on Justin's alleged missteps and more on Blake's legal strategy. Why was she so adamant about sealing certain pieces of evidence? What was in those text messages she didn't want revealed, and why did some filings seem vague or evasive? The most damaging speculation wasn't coming from her critics, it was coming from the lack of clarity in her own narrative. Blake's lawyers, aware of the growing pressure, filed a request to seal a series of documents that allegedly included sensitive internal messages, personal exchanges, and legal communications. They claimed it was to protect privacy, but the judge wasn't fully convinced. In fact, according to early courtroom sources, the judge began questioning why certain exhibits were being withheld if Blake's own complaint revolved around public reputation and damage. One quote that went viral came from the judge's own mouth during a hearing. "If the plaintiff is alleging public defamation, the public must understand the facts. The courtroom does not exist to protect curated reputations." That moment shifted public perception dramatically. Legal experts started discussing whether Blake's own filings could open the door to scrutiny. If she was claiming emotional harm from public narratives, wasn't it only fair to examine the full context, including her own private exchanges related to the case? By now, fans were divided. On one side were loyal supporters of Blake Lively, who believed she was under unfair attack by online critics and industry insiders alike. They argued that as a woman and mother in Hollywood, she had every right to defend her name and set boundaries. On the other side were skeptics, those who believed Blake was weaponizing the legal system to control a media narrative she could no longer influence through traditional PR. Then came the unexpected escalation. Blake's legal team sent subpoenas to several online content creators, including some who had only lightly commented on the case. The message was loud and clear: even minor commentary wasn't off limits. That move prompted backlash. Free speech advocates, legal commentators, and even mainstream journalists started questioning the intent behind the subpoenas. Was Blake's team using legal tools not to pursue justice but to intimidate? Some commentators referred to it as a Hollywood chilling effect. The public began to speculate, was Blake Lively trying to shut down dissent, not protect herself? Meanwhile, Baldoni stayed mostly quiet, letting Blake's legal strategy speak for itself. And it was working, just not in the way Blake hoped. Because the more Blake's team tried to silence, the more people began to dig. Legal experts and document analysts started reviewing every filing with a fine-toothed comb. And in one recent turn of events, they discovered something troubling: a court document submitted by Blake's attorneys themselves that appeared to contradict earlier statements made in both press and prior filings. The contradiction wasn't minor, it was potentially pivotal. The document included a timeline that placed Blake in communication with specific individuals before she claimed to have known about certain events. If that timeline is accurate, it could undercut her claims of unaware harm and suggest that she knew more than she publicly admitted. What makes a legal case unravel isn't always what's said in the courtroom. Sometimes it's what's not said, or more importantly, what someone tries to keep from being said. In the case of Blake Lively, her attempt to seal key evidence may have become the single biggest turning point in the legal battle, and the moment that cracked her case wide open. Let's dive into the details. After weeks of media speculation and closed-door maneuvering, Blake Lively's legal team filed a formal motion to seal certain documents submitted as part of discovery. These included, according to filings, personal messages, notes, and sensitive communications that they claimed would cause undue reputational harm if made public. On paper, it sounded like a reasonable request. After all, celebrities have a right to privacy too. But in the context of this case, the motion raised more questions than it answered. Why would a plaintiff, someone bringing a defamation case that's fundamentally about public reputation, seek to block the public from seeing the very communications that were supposedly so damaging? Legal analysts immediately noted the contradiction. If Blake was arguing that her character was unfairly harmed by someone else's words, shouldn't the court be allowed to review the full picture, including what she said, when, and to whom? The defense team representing Baldoni quickly seized on this. In their counter-motion, they argued that the documents Blake wanted sealed were central to the case. Not only did they provide context for the events in question, they also potentially contradicted several of Blake's main claims. According to the defense, sealing those materials would amount to withholding the full story, something that would ultimately mislead the court and the public. In an excerpt from their response, the defense wrote, "The plaintiff cannot cherry-pick the narrative. If she is to claim emotional and reputational harm in a public forum, the court must have access to all relevant communications, not just those that serve her version of events." That argument seemed to resonate not just with the public but with the court. During a hearing that drew heavy media attention, the presiding judge expressed concern about the motion to seal. In candid remarks, the judge stated that the request appeared to be more about image protection than actual legal necessity. And then, in what would become a viral moment across social media, the judge made a sharp observation. You cannot file a public lawsuit and then ask for a private trial. That's not how this works. From that point forward, the momentum shifted. Within days, the court issued a preliminary denial of the sealing request. meaning that at least some of the materials Blake's team wanted hidden would soon become part of the public record. And while the specifics were initially redacted or limited to legal teams' leaks, and inside reporting began to paint a troubling picture of what was inside. Among the documents reportedly unsealed were internal messages between Blake and members of her PR and legal teams, texts exchanged with third parties that appeared to reference Justin Baldoni, notes suggesting that media strategies may have been crafted in anticipation of backlash before any alleged harm had occurred. This last point became a major focus of analysis. If Blake's internal documentation shows that she and her team were preparing a media response, or preemptively managing public fallout before the alleged defamation ever went public, it could significantly undermine the emotional distress argument at the center of her case. Legal commentator Michael Stanson, appearing on a podcast, explained it like this: if a celebrity claims reputational harm but we find evidence that they were anticipating, planning for, or even exaggerating the narrative that speaks to intent, that changes everything. But the story didn't end with just unsealed messages. One particular exhibit, an email thread between Blake's publicist and a well-known Hollywood tabloid editor, included what many consider the smoking gun. In it, the publicist allegedly discusses repositioning the narrative around Blake's image and get-in G ahead of the Justin problem. The email predated any formal complaint or public accusation that analysts said suggested that Blake's team may have known that a story was going to emerge and wanted to control it before it did. While that doesn't inherently mean the allegations were false or exaggerated, it raises serious questions about timing, intention, and credibility. And here's where things really spiraled. Once the judge allowed parts of the sealed documents to enter the record, news outlets began requesting access. Multiple FOIA-style motions were filed by media organizations under pressure from both journalists and legal transparency advocates. The court began releasing redacted versions of the exhibits, enough to fuel a week's worth of headlines. Headlines like Blake Lively's emails to tabloid editor raise new questions. Court unseals explosive messages in Lively Baldoni feud. Did Blake try to silence the internet? Docs suggest so. Social media erupted. Hashtags like hashtag Blake unsealed, hashtag free the docs, and hashtag what is she hiding trended across platforms. Even former supporters began to express discomfort with the idea that Blake had tried to keep key details from the public, especially after she positioned herself as the wronged party. But even more damaging was how this move looked. To many legal professionals, Blake's request to seal materials seemed less like a matter of personal protection and more like an attempt to control evidence. And in a defamation case, credibility is everything. When a plaintiff appears evasive, it can weaken even the most legitimate claims. This wasn't just a PR problem, it was now a legal liability. The unsealed documents also put new pressure on witnesses. Several individuals mentioned in the exchanges were now being considered for deposition. The defense team hinted that they would call on these individuals to clarify timelines and intent, especially regarding what Blake knew and when she knew it. More importantly, the public was now seeing a version of Blake Lively they weren't used to. Gone was the perfectly polished star. In her place stood someone who, in the eyes of many, seemed deeply invested in controlling outcomes, even if it meant misrepresenting events or shutting down discussion. The public perception began to shift. Instead of viewing Blake as a victim of defamation, many began to see her as a powerful figure, trying to bend a legal process in her favor. While that may not be illegal, it certainly doesn't sit well in an era when transparency and accountability are demanded, especially from celebrities. As this part of the saga ends, one thing is clear: the attempt to seal the documents may have opened more doors than it closed. Blake's motion, likely filed to protect her, instead became a beacon, drawing attention to everything she wanted buried. And now, as depositions loom and new motions are filed, the evidence she tried to hide is not just on the table, it's front and center. And for Blake Lively, that could be a disaster of her own making. At the heart of any legal case lies a single principle: consistency. A plaintiff must remain consistent in their story, in their timeline, and in their evidence. If those elements begin to fracture, the entire structure risks collapse. And in Blake Lively's case, that collapse may have just begun, because a single legal document filed by her own team appears to directly contradict the foundation of her entire claim. It's the kind of twist no one saw coming, not even her staunchest supporters. Let's break it down. Following the judge's denial of Blake's request to seal specific pieces of evidence, several documents entered the public record. Among them was a deposition notice and timeline summary submitted by her legal team. At first glance, it seemed procedural, the kind of material that supports the organizational flow of a complex case, but one paragraph stood out. Buried deep within the document was a data timestamp on an email thread that would go on to shake the courtroom, the internet, and public perception. In this internal communication, Blake references a private conversation involving her publicist, and a media executive. The purpose of the conversation, according to the note, was to preemptively discuss fallout from Justin's upcoming project. The kicker: this message was dated 10 days before any public mention of Justin Baldoni's project even surfaced. Why is this important? Because Blake's legal case hinges on the assertion that she experienced reputational harm as a result of the public exposure related to that project. She and her attorneys have repeatedly insisted that any statements or scenes involved were unexpected, damaging, and triggered a wave of emotional distress and online harassment. But this email paints a different picture, one where Blake knew about the project, anticipated the reaction, and even strategized her media response before the alleged harm occurred. That legal experts argue changes everything on paper. This single contradiction could be interpreted into ways: 1. Blake's team made a clerical error, and the date is wrong. 2. Blake knew more than she admitted and constructed a narrative around selective memory. Neither interpretation helps her case. If it's a mistake, it shows a lack of attention to detail in a case where every date, every message, and every claim matters. If it's intentional, or worse, if it was overlooked entirely, it creates a major credibility issue. And in defamation or emotional harm cases, credibility is everything. Several legal analysts weighed in almost immediately. On a viral TikTok clip, a former entertainment lawyer stated, "This is what we call a material contradiction. It may not seem like a big deal to a casual observer, but in court this is catastrophic. It challenges the entire timeline and damages the plaintiff's trustworthiness." What made the situation worse was the timing. This filing came just days after Blake's team had argued in open court that she was blindsided by Justin's alleged actions. And now here was written proof from her own side suggesting that she wasn't blindsided at all. Social media exploded with side-by-side screenshots of Blake's public statements and the timeline revealed in the filing. One viral tweet read, "Blake said she didn't see it coming. Her lawyers just said she planned for it. What's the truth?" This wasn't just an issue of narrative anymore. It had become an issue of integrity. And as the internet dissected every detail, the courtroom began to respond in kind. Justin Baldoni's team wasted no time filing a motion to compel further discovery, specifically citing the contradictory timeline as evidence that more communications were likely being withheld or misrepresented. In that motion, they wrote, "The plaintiff's own submission calls her stated timeline into question. We respectfully request access to all communications during that period to determine the full scope of knowledge and intent." That request was granted, which means Blake Lively's team will now have to produce even more documents, messages, and records that may further expose the planning, strategy, and conversations that happened before the lawsuit was ever filed. And here's the most important part: the contradiction now allows the defense to paint a completely different picture of Blake's motives. Instead of a victim reacting to harm, they can now argue she was a public figure who anticipated criticism, prepared her image response, and then filed suit to silence dissent rather than to seek justice. For many in the public and the press, that's a far more damaging narrative. Major outlets began running editorials with headlines like, "Was Blake Lively's case a pre-planned PR strategy? Leaked timeline may undermine Lively's credibility." Hollywood defamation cases, when image becomes the goal. Meanwhile, fan reactions became more divided. While some continued to defend her, arguing that anticipating damage doesn't mean one isn't harmed by it, others said the contradiction revealed something deeper: a possible abuse of legal power to manage image rather than seek truth. To make matters worse, another document was leaked, this time from a related media outlet. The document allegedly included early drafts of op-eds and talking points circulated by someone close to Blake's inner circle. These op-eds appeared to be drafted before any legal action had been taken, further adding to speculation that this was always a coordinated effort. If those drafts are verified, they could be introduced as exhibits, reinforcing the defense's claim that Blake's harm was neither spontaneous nor unintended. This created a new line of inquiry: was Blake trying to win in the court of law, or just in the court of public opinion? Her team has yet to issue a formal statement responding to the contradictions, but silence may not be the best strategy. Public trust once lost is hard to regain, especially in a high-profile legal battle that plays out across headlines, trending hashtags, and real-time TikTok threads. And here's where the damage compounds, because it wasn't just one contradiction. Analysts reviewing earlier filings began spotting smaller, less obvious timeline inconsistencies. A conversation said to have happened in June was referenced in a July document, As taking place in early May, names that were redacted suddenly reappeared in later pages. A pattern was emerging, one that fairly or unfairly suggested either poor legal strategy or a deliberate pattern of confusion. In a case that hinges on emotional harm and reputational damage, the truth has to be airtight. The moment that truth appears selective, the case begins to unravel. And that's what we're watching happen, not slowly but in real time. If Blake Lively's legal team cannot explain the contradictions in their own filings, they face a growing risk of perjury implications, sanctions, or at minimum dismissal of key claims. Judges take accuracy seriously, and opposing counsel is watching every move, every document, ready to pounce. For now, the document that changed everything has done its damage. Whether it was a misstep, a miscommunication, or a miscalculation, the result is the same: doubt has entered the equation. And when doubt enters a courtroom, especially one filled with cameras, journalists, and internet sleuths, it rarely leaves quietly. From the outside, it all seemed so carefully managed, a story wrapped in polished PR, guarded legal filings, and a controlled public image. Blake Lively wasn't just fighting a case, she was protecting a legacy. As one of Hollywood's most photographed stars and a voice of curated grace, Blake stepped into the legal ring as if it were just another press tour, confident, strategic, and ready to win both in court and in headlines. But what has unfolded over the last several weeks has been anything but controlled. In fact, it's beginning to look like a complete collapse, one led not by her opponents but by her own decisions. What began as a defamation and reputational harm case has now turned into something far larger and far more damaging. Not because of a smoking gun uncovered by Justin Baldoni's team, but because of a series of contradictions, sealed filings, and strategic misfires made by Blake Lively's own lawyers. Each move that was meant to solidify her control has instead chipped away at her credibility. Every filing meant to protect has instead exposed. At the core of this chaos is a simple but devastating truth: Blake's narrative no longer aligns with the documents her legal team has submitted. The email dated before Justin's project was even public, the one where she discusses preemptive media strategies, shattered the foundation of her claim that she was caught off guard and emotionally blindsided. And even if that email was misdated or misinterpreted, the damage in the public eye was done. The contradiction cast a long shadow over every other aspect of her testimony and timeline. But perhaps even more damaging than the contradiction itself was the attempt to hide it. The motion to seal critical documents backfired in spectacular fashion. By trying to bury key pieces of context, Blake's team inadvertently drew more attention to them. The judge's sharp rebuke, "You cannot file a public lawsuit and then ask for a private trial," echoed far beyond the courtroom. It crystallized for many the very thing they had suspected, that Blake was less interested in justice and more interested in narrative control. Once the documents were unsealed, everything changed. The press began to question, legal analysts began to dig, fans began to wonder. Had they been misled? Was Blake Lively, the actress who seemed so calm and in control, actually orchestrating a much more aggressive and calculated campaign behind the scenes? The truth might be more nuanced, but in the court of public opinion, nuance often doesn't stand a chance. Public trust is fragile, especially when celebrity is involved. Blake's attempt to subpoena small content creators, some with barely any reach, was seen by many as a step too far. Instead of portraying her as a woman trying to reclaim her truth, it made her appear like a figure of unchecked power, using legal threats to silence criticism. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether Justin had defamed her, but whether Blake was trying to suppress independent voices who challenged her version of events. And all of this was happening against the backdrop of a broader conversation in Hollywood about transparency, power, and the weaponization of reputation. The days of celebrities controlling every narrative are fading fast. Audiences now demand more authenticity, more accountability, and less manipulation. When they sense they're being played, they push back. In Blake's case, the pushback has been fierce. Legal observers now say that her case is in critical condition. The contradiction in her own filing could lead to parts of her claim being thrown out. The unsealed documents have opened the door to new discovery demands, possibly dragging more of her communications and her inner circle into the spotlight. And media outlets, once cautious about covering the case too critically, are now openly questioning her motives. Even other celebrities are watching, some reportedly distancing themselves, while others remain silent. Taylor Swift's camp, once believed to be loosely aligned with Blake during this ordeal, has notably gone quiet. And Hollywood's PR machines, always ready to pivot, have started to treat Blake's name with increased caution. She's no longer the untouchable face of prestige and poise. She's now the center of an unraveling court case with real consequences. The question remains, where does Blake Lively go from here? Legally, the road ahead will be difficult. The court will continue to review motions, depositions, and filings. More evidence may surface, and it's likely that both sides will prepare for the long haul. But the bigger battle may not be in the courtroom, it may be in the court of public opinion, and Blake is losing that battle fast. Her silence in recent days, once considered an elegant choice, now reads like avoidance. Each day without clarity or response only allows the narrative to spiral further beyond her control. And if her team is still trying to protect her image behind closed doors, it may be too late. The damage has already seeped into the cultural memory. She is no longer just an actress with a lawsuit. She is now a case study in how even the most carefully curated public images can implode under the weight of truth. There is, however, a path forward. But it won't be found in sealed documents, subpoenas, or silence. It will require transparency, accountability, and perhaps most painfully, humility. If Blake Lively chooses to speak honestly about what happened, why decisions were made, and how she plans to correct the narrative, she may still be able to rebuild some of the trust that has been lost. But if she continues down the current path, doubling down, silencing dissent, and avoiding the tough questions, then this case will be remembered not just as a celebrity lawsuit gone wrong, but as a cautionary tale for an entire generation of stars who believed that power could protect them from scrutiny. Because in the end, it wasn't Justin Baldoni or the media or social commentary that destroyed Blake Lively's case, it was Blake herself.